If we want students to be curious, if we want students to be reflective, if we want students to think about their thinking, leaders need to model that for their staff. And of course, so often when we attend staff meetings or professional development, the opposite occurs. It's teachers sit for an hour and they go through an agenda and it's a sit and get. And then at the end of the meeting, we talk about how we're an inquiry-based school. Or at the front of our building, it says we value inquiry and agency and curiosity. And teachers are like, well, that's not aligned. Undeniably, teachers will revert back to their leadership. So some of those traditional data sets, the report card, the portfolio, those are very helpful. But gosh, the richest data we get from our students is from our students themselves. Time is a theme, isn't it? For faculties to come together and teams to come together, and for you and I to sit down and talk about our learners, leaders need to give their teachers some time to have these rich conversations that reflect the values of the school. How are our schools operating to support the things we value? If we value student-centered assessment, if we value student growth, how does our assessment calendar, for example, reflect that? I visited some schools around the world who I won't go in and train teachers in student-centered assessment practices until they change their assessment calendar. I have to be frank, because their assessment calendar, you know what their assessment calendar communicates to everyone who looks at it? It says performance, 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 performance.
So this shift from assessment is something I do to you versus assessment is something that we do together, and there's purpose and intention behind it. And that purpose is your curiosity and taking it further.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some really, specific scaffolded steps that we can take to include our students in this conversation.
Welcome to the School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their communities and schools. In each episode, we'll talk to extraordinary thinkers and doers about their experiences and experiments with teaching and learning. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle. Toddle is your all-in-one teaching and learning platform, made for teachers and by teachers. For our very first episode, we spoke to the one and only Trevor MacKenzie. Trevor is not only a teacher, author, and expert of building cultures of assessment in schools, but he's also somebody I deeply admire and respect. As Trevor's biggest fan, I couldn't imagine a better way to kickstart this show. In today's episode, Trevor talks about the why behind student-centered assessment. He also invites us to think of ways we might humanize our assessment practices in schools, to move away from what we've just always done in the past, and towards ways that we can use assessment to empower our students to become learners. And he shares some extinct assessment practices and the ways we can intentionally stop those as leaders. Trevor challenges us to lead an assessment culture driven both by our values and empathy, and to really give time to work on these things to create change in the things that are meaningful to us. I really think you're going to love this episode. So buckle up, get ready to be inspired, and let's dive into the conversation. All right, Trevor, I am so excited to have you here on the first ever episode of the School Leaders Project. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor. What an honor. This is exciting. So this will be a lot of fun. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with you.
Oh, me too. Always. All right, let's jump right in. So Trevor, will you set the stage for us? What is the work that you do? What are you most passionate about and why?
I'm really passionate about curiosity, wonder, awe, us being inquisitive. And when I say us, I mean learners and teachers and all stakeholders in schools around the world. So I'm very keen on curiosity. And I'm very much interested in getting interrogative about our teaching practice. Why do we do the things we do? What are our blind spots, our shadow spaces as teachers? And are we truly doing the best thing for our students? Are we truly listening to our students and connecting and collaborating and partnering with them? So I think in a nutshell, if we were to put that in a bowl, it would fall in a constructivist bowl, an inquiry-based learning bowl. So I am an inquiry practitioner and author and teacher. But I'm very interested in curiosity and reflecting on our teaching practice, Cindy.
And I like to balance that. You are still in the classroom. So can you just give context? You're in the classroom and an author. So how does that all work?
Yeah. I'm often asked that. How do you do all the things, Trevor? So I am a teacher. I am a high school teacher in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. I'm in my 20th year of teaching. And I have to admit, I love both worlds of teaching teachers and teaching students. So I've been really stubborn in keeping a foot firmly planted in both areas. And quite a number of years ago, I started to speak about my teaching, share my speaking more broadly, blogging and tweeting, and then slowly speaking at conferences kind of regionally and across Canada. And then that led to publications and research and more consulting, more visiting schools around the world who have similar values around inquiry and constructivism and curiosity. So this particular year is the first year where I've reduced my teaching load to half time. So I teach afternoons, which just feels so strange to teach less, but that's enabling me to teach teachers more and to work more with the schools that I partner with around the world. So as we know, it's a balance, teaching teachers and teaching students, but goodness, it's one that I certainly adore and appreciate and I'm grateful for. I'd feel really awkward talking about something that I haven't tried on for size myself with my own scholars. So a lot of the work I do is, of course, if it's a questioning protocol, well, it's a questioning protocol that I've tried with my students, isn't it? So walking the walk and talking the talk is something that I deeply value.
Well, and your Instagram is fire. So like leaders out there, if you're looking for examples of these things in action in a classroom, Trevor's Insta is wild. So
thank you. I do enjoy sharing, and my students know that's been a huge revealing for the kids the last number of years, is that I do share our learning with their permission and consent to teachers and leaders around the world. So thanks, Cindy, for that shout out. That's greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. So in this conversation today, Trevor, I really want to hone in on assessment. So you just wrote the book on inquiry-driven assessment, and I want to think about leaders and how we create that space. So first of all, do you prefer the term student-centered assessment or inquiry-driven assessment, or do you use them both?
Yeah, I use them both rather interchangeably, but I think at the heart, we're talking about student-centered assessment. So I don't want teachers and leaders to get confused around what inquiry-based assessment is. The two are quite synonymous, so I use them both interchangeably.
Thanks for clarifying. Can you explain to our audience what exactly is student-centered assessment and why is it so important?
Well, I'll give you a bit of a problem statement, a little bit of a problem scenario that I've seen over the course of this work in supporting schools implement inquiry-based learning around the world. And that is when we survey kids, and we survey a lot of kids, we survey hundreds of kids. When we survey kids about curiosity, they tell us some amazing things. And so curiosity is a byproduct of inquiry. If we're teaching from an inquiry stance and planning for inquiry, we're going to have more curious kids. And so when we survey kids, we ask them to tell us out of 10, a curiosity scale, 1 to 10, how curious are you about your learning? When they tell us an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, that means they're really curious. There are some amazing points of data that correlate to that. So when we have kids who are really curious, we see achievement increase, grades improve, kids do better in classes where they're more curious. I love that. That's great. We also see an improvement in attendance. So kids not only attend school more readily, they attend school more often. So, again, if they're interested in the learning, if they're curious about what they're learning about, they're going to come to class. The third piece is when we survey kids and we ask them questions about inquiry, questions about their learning, they tell us the darndest things, Cindy. They tell us, when I'm curious, I enjoy school. School is a place of belonging. School is a place of safety, of trust. I trust my teachers. I trust my peers. I love all of those things. Simultaneously, when we question them about assessment, they tell us a completely different scenario and completely different feelings. When we ask them about the learning, they say the learning is enjoyable. When we ask them about assessment, they say things like assessment causes me stress. Assessment causes me anxiety. Assessment causes me uncertainty. And so, you know what I did? This was fascinating data. When I started to see this data roll out over the course of a number of years, I took the exact same survey and I brought it to my students in my classroom. And I asked them the exact same questions. And I was curious, would they say the same things around assessment and inquiry that other students were saying at other schools around the world? And they, in fact, said different things. They said assessment informs my learning. Their words, not mine. They said assessment guides my next steps. One question we ask students is assessment a teacher job, a student job, or an us job? And the students on the survey at these schools around the world would say that that's a teacher's job, where my students would say that's an us job. And I thought, well, this is telling. What am I doing in my assessment practice that I'm not seeing at the schools I'm supporting? And how could I support these schools in not just engaging in inquiry, but flattening the landscape of their assessment practice to include more student voice, more student understanding? And to be honest, we want assessment capable kids. I love that phrase. Isn't that beautiful, Cindy? How do we create the conditions for our students to become more assessment capable? So that's why I wrote that one publication, Inquiry Mindset Assessment Edition, is to show teachers how to engage in more student-centered assessment practices, so their inquiry experience and their assessment experience are beautifully woven together rather than kind of misaligned and, the assessment is a them thing, whereas inquiry is really meaningful and rich in agency, and I belong in inquiry, but assessment is a teacher job. So that's been the driving force to bringing more assessment conversations into the inquiry classroom in my work, not just with my students, but with schools that I support around the world.
So this shift from assessment is something I do to you versus assessment is something that we do together, and there's purpose and intention behind it. And that purpose is your curiosity and taking it further.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some really, specific scaffolded steps that we can take to include our students in this conversation more. I'm not proposing that we relinquish control over assessment, as a misconception is an inquiry, isn't it? Inquiry means kids have entire control over their learning. We know that's not the case. It's mirrored in the assessment practice as well. There's scaffolding, there's intentionality, there's some planning that's involved with regards to how do we build assessment capable students across a span of time.
I'm glad you addressed that, because I think that's a common misconception in this space is, so we don't have success criteria anymore. What about the standards that we're held to?
Yeah. That's a question I face and I'm sure you do as well, Cindy, in your work. It's, well, what about the standards? How do you include student voice and assessment when we have these really clear success criteria that we have to teach towards? And gosh, I love success criteria. I love rubrics that are mandated to us. They're so helpful, but I don't just drop those on the learning. I don't just smack those on top of the students. I tuck those aside and I use them as a blueprint to a co-designing conversation, activity experience where I ask students questions and we gather together success criteria from prior knowledge, from exemplars, and the holes that are left in that conversation are the holes that I fill with my assessment expertise and that blueprint that I'm mandated to use. So eventually we create a rubric that looks a lot similar to the rubric I have to use, but that was built with student understanding, student voice, student belonging, and student-friendly language, which undeniably means they're going to do better using that rubric than any rubric I just hand to them, because we spent time building it together. It's their language, it's their understanding. My job is to make sure that those two rubrics are pretty aligned, isn't it? The blueprint and the rubric we build, they have to look, sound, and feel and serve a really similar purpose in terms of the assessment intent. That's time well spent. It is beautiful time
Agreed.
spent with students when we build those rubrics, those success criteria together. So one part that we're talking about, Cindy, is breaking down the misconception. Another one is, well, how do we do it, Trevor? If that's not the way, then what does it look like in practice? And so that little experience I just spoke to you about, that's something we train schools in, we train teachers in, co-designing success criteria with scholars.
Well, it sounds like it takes a high level of expertise, but in a way it would become almost natural as you acquired that skill set. Like, of course, we're going to build this with students. We're not just going to give it to them in the end.
Yeah, and I don't want people listening to think that's a Trevor thing or that's a Cindy thing. They could do that. I can never do that. We can all engage in these conversations with our students. We can all ask particular questions. We can all listen and build together. That is a flipping of the hierarchy of many classrooms around the world where teachers are giving assessments to kids. Kids are doing the assessments, giving them back to teachers, and we grade them. It is really changing the landscape of how we engage with our scholars, but that is at the heart of inquiry, isn't it? is that we partner with students, we ask, we listen, we build together. We want our assessment practice to mirror those things. If that's what we value in inquiry, then of course our assessment experiences have to mirror that as well.
Awesome. I'd love to bring in a question from our Facebook group. So this comes from Amber. And I think it addresses kind of this elephant in the room, that a lot of us have these beliefs about assessment, but then in comes a standardized test or in comes a summative assessment. And it feels like the pressure kind of goes up for those. And that's where all the focus goes for students and for families. So how do you balance having those assessments, but also valuing kind of the entire process?
Yeah, well, those assessments, I don't undervalue those. I don't not do them with my scholars. They're very important. That data is critical. Those data points, any data that we can collect from a large body of students where we can make some assumptions, we can analyze them, we can compare them across a large data set. That's important. But the other set of data holds great importance as well. The color, the qualitative, the conferencing, the evidencing, the feedback. And so what we propose in schools that are engaged in inquiry is striking a more powerful balance between our summatives and our formatives, between those really, really high stakes standardized tests and our rich formative feedback, coaching, and conferencing. Undeniably, we don't want to get our kids ready for standardized tests by giving them more standardized tests. Right. And that can be really hard for some teachers to hear. We want them to engage in more test prep and practice tests to get them ready for the high stakes tests. The opposite is actually true. We want to take them to performances less often and get them into coaching mode more often. We want to provide opportunity for reflection, assessment capable opportunities where they're understanding where they're at, where they need to go, and what steps they need to take to get there. And if we can live in what Guy Claxton calls learning mode more often and performance mode less, undeniably our students are going to do better on those standardized assessments. I have to be honest, like the balance I poke teachers to get to is kind of a 90-10 balance. 90% informative, 10% in summative. And sometimes teachers think, how is that possible? Well, I asked schools and school leaders, how many times are teachers mandated to do a standardized assessment? How many times across their assessment calendar do they have to do an assessment like that?
What are the musts?
And what are the musts? And to be honest, if we know the feedback, the conferencing, the formative is richer to guide next steps, then let's live there more often than the standardized pieces. So the 90-10 split, I know it's not a split, it's a ratio, is really, well, what are the non-negotiables? And let's do those and those alone. So numbers aren't guiding learning. The formative, the conversations, the qualitative is guiding the learning. Does that make sense, Cindy?
Totally. And I think some of the language I'd like to call out there that leaders could use with tricky families is the idea of it's a data set. And this is a relevant piece of data, but it is just one piece in this entire collection that we've curated.
Absolutely. And looking at some of the research around what those data sets do to guide student learning, does a number guide student learning, or does the formative and the qualitative guide student learning? So if we are about improving those data sets, improving those numbers, then we have to live in more opportunity for coaching, reflection, and guiding next steps, which again, that's that 90% space. Yes. And 10% is that quantitative space.
Amazing. All right. So our audience is mostly leaders. So I'm curious, what do you think that every leader should know, understand, and do in terms of student-centered assessment?
Well, I'd love for leaders to talk about extinct assessment practices, like really clearly talk to a staff, their faculty about what we don't do anymore. And I love that language. It's really liberating for a teacher to hear that from a leader. We don't assess that way anymore. There are certain things that we maybe did 5 years ago or 20 years ago, and now we know best practice. We know the research tells us that those things don't guide learning and don't propel students in terms of growth. So some things I hear leaders say, that some things I nudge leaders to say, for example, is we don't take the average of marks anymore. We don't take the average of numbers anymore, and we don't plunk them into a system and out comes an average. An average does not tell a representation of a student's learning across time. In fact, the most recent data point could take precedence over all those other data points across a span of time. And I know for some teachers, they hear that, oh, thank goodness, that's so liberating. Then we look at our grade book. How do we manage a grade book that honors the most recent data set compared to all the previous attempts for learning? Gosh, we rely on our professional judgment, don't we? Our professional responsibility and expertise. I want leaders to say that in front of staff as well. Like, I trust your professional assessment expertise. I trust that you're going to make the decisions that are going to inform students and guardians of where students are at and what their next steps are. So that would be something that I would say is an extinct assessment practice, is averaging out learning across time and honoring the most recent learning, the most recent data set as representative of where our students are at now. Another piece is living in the formative and not living in the summative. I referenced this a little bit earlier, Cindy, but anytime, the research tells us, anytime we put a number on evidence of learning and we attach feedback to that number and that evidence of learning, students will not look at the feedback. They'll only look at the number. This should be a non-negotiable in schools. If you're giving feedback, it is detached of a number. Numbers and feedback cannot coexist. They have to be separated. Teachers undeniably want to gather numbers because it fits beautifully in the grade book. It fits beautifully in the spreadsheet. It's the feedback that will drive the learning, and it's the feedback that will propel the learning. The number will shut down the learning. I want to hear leaders say that aloud to teachers. You don't have to gather numbers all day long. Instead, live in formative, live in feedback more often, and detach the two, the feedback from the number. These assessment truths, these are best practices. Many teachers, they won't do them unless they hear a leader speak to them and say, this is the space that we're in now. That Safety. Way of doing it, we don't do anymore. Now we engage in these practices that we know are good for kids, that we know are good for propelling learning moving forward.
So for reporting, would you advocate for just a feedback only report card? Or like, how do you make that jump from only feedback to scoring with a number? And then I think that comes back to that question about parents. Like, if parents are seeing a number on a report card, how do we convince them that that's not the most important thing?
Yeah, let me paint a beautiful picture for you. In my province right now, in British Columbia, Canada, I know I'm going to have all these people sending me messages, DMs, and requests. I want to come to British Columbia. It's a fascinating place to be a teacher and to have sons that are students in public education here. K-9, we've gone gradeless. K-9, students only receive qualitative. It's like rich feedback. There's a performance scale. The amount of feedback and color we get on report cards as parents. It's so beautiful to see that my son's teachers know them so well. So that's lovely, isn't it? Wow. Can't we all get there? You know what happens come grade 10? You know what happens when my son next year comes to my high school? He all of a sudden gets this rich feedback and he gets a number. And so the professional responsibility on the educator is to, how do I provide the feedback and then turn all that feedback into a number at the end of the day on a report card? You know how I do that is I sit with students one-on-one. We look at the portfolio, we look at the evidence, we look at all the feedback, and we pick a number together. And, awesome. And when we talk about assessment capable kids, they should be able to have that conversation openly, honestly, confidently, and be able to pick a number that is somewhat aligned with the number that I've been assessing throughout our time together. We should be able to agree on a number. It's not a debate. It's not an assessment. What do you call it? An assessment proposal. They're not trying to convince me that they deserve a mark. It's that we're looking at the rich body of work, the rich evidence, and my feedback throughout learning, and we're deciding on a number together. Isn't that a friendly experience, a kind experience, a compassionate experience, an equitable experience? I love having those conversations with kids. Now, that's the landscape of British Columbia. That's, K-9, gradeless, high school. We have to do both. Gosh, can't we do those practices in every circumstance, in every school around the world? Can't we sit with kids, talk about the evidence of learning, and come up with a number together? Absolutely, we can. Again, it's a reframe of how we spend time with kids. Initially, I said we want it not to be a teacher's job. We want it to be an us job. an assessment conference where we're talking about a report card and writing it somewhat together and picking a number together, that would be an amazing kind of direction for schools around the world to go to.
I adore that. I always felt that tension as a teacher. It just felt so random to put a number at the end. So that's what a viable solution to that.
Random. And so what makes us feel better is when our grade book spits out an average, like this really fine, 72.6. And we say, yay, that's the number I'll put. But that averaging of numbers does not represent the richness and the color and the lived experience of our learners, of our scholars. Looking at the evidence, talking about the feedback, coaching that conversation and coming up with a number together is much more realistic in terms of a representation of a student's growth and a student's learning, isn't it?
Because it comes back to, what is the point of this? It's not to judge a kid or make them feel shame. It's to help them grow. And the process that you've outlined that's the sole intention there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I can anticipate what some leaders who may be listening to this conversation, Cindy, are thinking, like, how do we remove bias from those conversations, Trevor? How do we make sure that all teachers are somewhat equal in their conversation so that all parents who know this practice is going on can trust that the conversation is equitable and fair and actually getting their students to a place where everyone feels happy and content? When I first started this practice, I had similar concerns. I thought to myself, how am I going to be unbiased with some of my students that drive me nuts, that drive me bonkers? How am I going to sit down patiently and really be unbiased in those circumstances? You know what I did? I invited a colleague. I invited a neighbor or a faculty colleague and said, could you sit on a few of these conversations and just listen and give me some feedback and let me know if you felt like I was out of line or off track, or I wasn't being equitable, I wasn't being safe, or any kind of feedback. And we began to do these little rounds of kind of peer-reviewed assessment conferences. And it was so helpful for me to recognize my blind spots, to recognize my body language, to recognize my tone, to have a critical friend guide me through some of that practice. And so now that's something that schools that I support that are engaged in this work, that's a step of the process, is that they don't start by conferring with students one-on-one. They actually start by conferring with a student and a colleague coming in or another student coming in for feedback around the experience in and of itself. Isn't that beautiful?
So beautiful. And like, what a way to just double check for your clarity there. And to make sure that you're seeing the same picture across classrooms too. I'm thinking about in the elementary setting with specialists, like, what does it look like in the homeroom versus in the music class? And what similarities and differences are we seeing and why?
Yeah. That creates not just assessment equity, all students in every grade and every classroom should have an equal opportunity to demonstrate success. And one way we do that is we create assessment transparency across classrooms. My neighbor next door who teaches the exact same course, the exact same grade, the exact same curriculum, how can we be on the same page in terms of our assessment practices so a student can be in either class and have an equal opportunity to demonstrate success? Well, we open up our assessment practice to one another. We talk about our assessment. We assess together. So then when she leads a conference and I give her feedback, there's a direction that the school is taking that is somewhat uniform, that is somewhat equal for all students and stakeholders. And gosh, isn't it easy for a leader then to have those hard conversations with parents? If the leader can ensure that there's that level of equity across the staff, then those conversations with parents are so much more easily handled and experienced and encountered.
Like any of our practices, if we're grounded in research and if we're being intentional, then the conversation, Kimberly Mitchell said, we shouldn't be brought to war. And I love that phrase, that if we're intentional and there's research that backs us, then there's no reason ever for us to go to war on a stance that we have.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
I'd love to shift a little bit. So one of my big things is that leaders should model. So if we're thinking of student-centered assessment, what might it look like for a leader to model this, whether it's in strategic planning or growth, or how might leaders do this?
Yeah, well, my mind goes to two places right away. Let's start at the minutia first, the nuance and the often overlooked pieces that I think leaders should be aware of in terms of how they interact with teachers. And it's that they need to model the dispositions we want teachers to be cultivating with their students. If we want students to be curious, if we want students to be reflective, if we want students to think about their thinking, leaders need to model that for their staff. And of course, so often when we attend staff meetings or professional development, the opposite occurs. It's teachers sit for an hour and they go through an agenda, and it's a sit and get. And then at the end of the meeting, we talk about how we're an inquiry-based school. Or at the front of our building, it says we value inquiry and agency and curiosity. And teachers are like, well, that's not aligned. Undeniably, teachers will revert back to their leadership. And so leaders modeling these dispositions, leaders living by them, that has such great traction to the growth of inquiry and student-centered assessment in a school. You know, an easy example is a go back. I love a good go back, right, Cindy, where we're talking to a colleague, we're having a conversation, and then we actually mindfully leave the conversation. And then a day later or a couple days later, we go back to that same colleague and we model the dispositions. We say something like, I was reflecting on our conversation yesterday, and one thing you said really made me curious. And I started to think about, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? You hear all that language I just used? I was reflecting, it made me curious, it got me thinking, and now I'm wondering. And I'm asking, I'm inviting them. Gosh, in that one interaction, I'm modeling so much that we want teachers to nurture for their scholars, with their scholars. So goodness, I think of Linda Kaiser and Judy Halbert's work with regards to leading an inquiry. I think of Jessica Vance's work in leading an inquiry. We have to model the model in terms of the dispositions. The second piece I think of with your question, Cindy, and this is a big one, it's structurally, how are our schools operating to support the things we value? If we value student-centered assessment, if we value student growth, how does our assessment calendar, for example, reflect that? I visited some schools around the world who I won't go in and train teachers in student-centered assessment practices until they change their assessment calendar. I have to be frank, because their assessment calendar, you know what their assessment calendar communicates to everyone who looks at it? It says performance, 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 performance. Every month, there's some kind of high stakes assessment. Why are we going to engage in student-centered assessment practices if every month students are being hit over the head with a high stakes standardized assessment? We need to change our assessment calendar. So perhaps it's more in that 90-10 range that I referred to earlier. Maybe a high stakes assessment, rather than happening every month, happens every term or every semester. And then that way teachers are liberated to live in that space of formative feedback, of conferring and coaching. If they're not, then they're going to feel pressured to continue to give more standardized assessments, to give more numbers. But if we can liberate some space to have students and teachers live in learning mode, again, as Guy Claxton refers to it, then the assessment calendar is going to be freed up for those rich standardized assessments that occur every semester or term, as opposed to every 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Assessment calendar is a big one. There are many other structures that we engage in schools that I would say all teachers and staff engage in. You know, another one, Cindy, and I'm sure you did this in your practice as well, is parent-teacher interviews, or even better, student-led conferences. I love student-led conferences, but can we really mandate what student-led conferences look like and sound like and feel like? As leaders, absolutely we can. Does it have to be about the numbers? Does it have to be about the grades? Or can it be about the competencies, the portrait of a learner? Can it be about their evidence of learning? Can it be about walking their parents through the classroom and the story the classroom tells in terms of the student's experience? I love student-led conferences, but are student-led conferences about the learning or about the number? Of course, It should be about the learning, and a leader has a big impact on creating that culture of what a student-led conference or a student-led evening, gala, showcase could look like and sound like and feel like, to ensure that it represents and is reflective of the values of the school. Student-led, student-centered, and inquiry-driven. Does that make sense, Cindy?
I think that would be a lovely process for every administrator listening to go through. I think sometimes we stack things without thinking of it. Oh, for reading, we're doing F&P testing, and for this, we're doing this testing. Make a calendar out exactly when all of the assessments are, and what is this communicating to families? What is this communicating to students about what we believe about assessment? And does that mirror our assessment philosophy that we have written down? Like, Oof, that's some powerful stuff.
It's not easy work, Cindy, is it? It's not easy work to, I referenced earlier calling a colleague into an assessment conference to help me with my blind spots. This is a very similar feeling for leaders to consider. Let's look at our assessment calendar and what is it communicating to those people that are looking at it. Another really clear indication for me is I want to look at a school's Instagram account and I want to see what it communicates about the values of the school. If it's about the most recent scholarship or the most recent award or the most recent student application that got accepted to a big university, then that's communicating to parents that that's what we're about at this school. But if it's communicating a richer experience, a student-led experience, where every so often those experiences get them a scholarship or take them to a prestigious university, that's a very different communication of values than the awards, the scholarships, the Ivy League. And I've seen schools around the world that those are the two stories, right? And what story do we want to write as a leader? We want to write the leader of the student experience and how student-centered it truly is, and not just having it be a vision statement above the entryway to a school building, isn't it?
Adore that. Another piece of it I hoped you'd touch on is that as teachers, we're in a continuous journey of growth as well. And oftentimes the models that we're using to assess teachers don't really align with our school beliefs. So what would you see as being like the best model for growing teachers in this student assessment model?
Well, I often see the strongest work being done by teachers who have critical friends or teams of teachers who, if we're talking about assessment, they actually talk about assessment. Like they get together and they bring evidence of learning and they pass it around the room. They talk about their assessment tensions and how they can soften those tensions. One thing that we recently engaged in at my school was the tension around due dates. Some teachers were feeling like, gosh, I can't get my kids some of them to get their work done by the due date. And we had this really rich conversation around, well, what's the purpose of the due date? Have we surveyed our kids in choosing a due date? Have we chosen a due date randomly because it works for us? Have we considered the landscape of the student experience in arbitrarily choosing a due date? So we started to survey some of our kids around what they have going on in their lives around some of our due dates. So for example, Trevor will pick a due date, Friday, May 19th. That's my due date for my kids. And then I would survey them and say, what other assessments do you have due around the same time? What other responsibilities do you have going on during that week? What can I hear from my students that maybe shifts that due date around or gives some flexibility based on what my students are telling me? And so what we've done at my school is for some of our faculty, we've adopted what we call due date windows, which is we propose a range of dates. And within that range of dates, students, high school students, are choosing when they're going to turn in their work. So for example, on that May 19th date that I arbitrarily chose, and then all my students are telling me, well, I have a math test on that day, or a chem test on that day, or another essay in history due on that day, I give them the full week to turn it in. And then the conversation is quite different, Cindy, isn't it? The conversation goes to, well, when are you going to turn it in and why? Well, I'm going to turn it in on Monday because later in the week it's busier for me. Or I'm going to turn it in on Friday because my earlier week is busier for me. That the conversation turns to what works best for the individual student rather than me making some arbitrary assessment decision that actually negatively impacts the data I'm collecting from my students. Another piece that ends up happening with a due date window that is really, really beautiful is I see a trickle of assessments being turned in throughout the week. So if you can imagine the essay example, I see a few essays on Monday, maybe a few on Tuesday, maybe another handful on Wednesday, maybe a huge amount on Friday. But you know what that allows me to do, Cindy? It allows me to more effectively and patiently give feedback each and every day because I'm seeing a smaller dose of evidence. There's nothing worse than seeing a big pile of evidence that you have to give feedback to. By the time you get halfway through the pile, you're exhausted. You're have I read the same thing a dozen times? It allows us to be unbiased, patient, specific, and kind in the feedback that we give. So that's something that I encourage all leaders to consider is how do you create the conditions for teachers to connect, to collaborate, to work together with regards to assessment, and then they make decisions around some of those tensions in assessment to best meet the students' needs. Does that make sense, Cindy?
It does. I'm hearing a theme of within your classroom or in the leadership level, taking almost an empathetic design approach that we're saying, hey, these are problems. We're not assuming anyone is bad or wrong in this. Let's figure this out together. And I think if we can all adopt that attitude of curiosity over assumption, that alone can be so transformative in our schools.
Absolutely. I say trust the professional integrity of your staff to come together when they're given time to make the best decisions possible for their scholars. And of course, if the value is centering the student, whether it's inquiry or assessment, then of course that value is going to be demonstrated in the time that's provided for staff to connect and collaborate around those tensions or those values. Absolutely. You said empathetic. I love that word. I couldn't agree more.
This question comes from Twitter, and it's a little bit different. I think it's Anila. Yeah, Anila on Twitter asked us about how do we kind of pass data on? So especially if we're moving in this feedback driven stance, what are the best ways that we can communicate this learning journey from one grade level to the next?
Well, I would say we want to look at diversity, like just not one form of communication, but diversity. Some of the richest experiences that we can have with students are in conferring with them. And when I say conferring, I just don't mean a conference. I mean having conversations, having a talk about the learning, whether it's one-on-one or in a small group setting. And so sometimes the best evidence of that being transferred on to another grade level is the conversation a teacher can have with the students when they come in the room. It's not that I'm passing data on to Cindy because, Cindy, you teach them next year. It's, well, Cindy, check in with them. Have a student-centered conference at the start of the year, asking them about what worked for them in the past. What were their strengths last year? What were their stretches last year? Have them share that with you and have that guide some of your understanding of the scholars before them. There's nothing worse for students than feeling like they can't shake off past mistakes, is there? There's nothing worse for students than walking into a classroom on the first day of school feeling like they're already being judged or labeled based on something that happened last year. The best way to honor the students before you is to engage in listening, asking the right questions. One question we ask our students in the inquiry model as we get to know them is, what works best for your learning? How can I best meet your needs? And we listen, and then we plan accordingly. We document that. In my classroom, we have a learning wall where some of these attributes and some of this data is collected. And I often go up to this learning wall and I think about, well, my students have told me this. My students have told me that. How can I plan this week or today or this month with this data in mind? So some of those traditional data sets, the report card, the portfolio, those are very helpful. But gosh, the richest data we get from our students is from our students themselves. Conversely, there's nothing informative about a number. I have to say, like, Cindy, you could be a 76. What does that tell me about you?
Yeah.
It tells me where you are across the bell curve. It tells me where you are across other students. It doesn't tell me what your strengths are or your stretches are. It doesn't tell me how I can best meet your needs. It just allows me to make a broad comparison to see where you fit in against a greater group of people. I really want to focus on the qualitative. So if I see a 76, I want to see the commentary. I want to see the feedback. I want to see that evidence that perhaps the student has written or a teacher has written that shows the color of the landscape of that student's learning. So I'm very hesitant about looking at grades from a previous year to get an indication of where a student is. The most powerful way is to facilitate a conversation around students' strengths, stretches, what they need from you, and have a really honest listen and use that data to guide your instructional design. Does that make sense?
It does. I feel a tension there, though, between a fresh start and all of this beautiful data that's been collected, both by the student and the teacher.
Yeah.
Do you see any kind of systems that leaders can put in place to make sure that that isn't lost, that all of these ahas that we've had in the prior year aren't lost?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a both and more. It's not an either or. So the scenario I described where we're conferring with kids as we get to know them, know me before you teach me, that philosophy of really settling into who the scholars are before us, that and the rich data and evidence that was collected, that was interrogated, that was evidenced across a whole year, we need to do both. So many schools I support, as We are engaged in that know me before you teach me philosophy in the first weeks of getting to know our students. We're also getting together and we're conferring with teachers. So Cindy, if I'm passing on a group of students to you, we would have a little conference ourselves where we would look at that data and you would say, tell me about Jimmy, tell me about Caitlin, tell me about Rebecca. And I would tell you the things that you want to know about based on that data and my rich experience that I had with my scholars the previous year. Now, some settings that creates, or that's a little difficult to do, right? Like in my high school, there are 1,400 kids. The 30 that I had last year, they're all of a sudden in different rooms with different teachers. We can minimize that by having a faculty meeting where we do a give one, get one, or we walk through the room and does anyone know Caitlin? Oh, I know Caitlin. Okay, come over here. Those conversations are very rich, and there are ways in which we can support those conversations in our school. So I don't want to give the impression that it's an either or. The data that's collected across a span of time is richly informative, but there has to be that space to show all the nuance of the learning. And a report card alone just doesn't do it. So imagine this scenario, Cindy, is I email you a spreadsheet about the students that you're teaching, and you're tasked with reading the spreadsheet to try to figure out what's important or who the students are before you. That's not helpful. But imagine you and I sit down and I talk you through the spreadsheet and you ask me questions, and then I bring out some of the evidence and I tell you the story of some of those learners. Way more helpful, way more colorful. So a both and more rather than an either or. I think a constant theme that's slowly surfacing here is some time needs to be given for those conversations. Time is a theme, isn't it? For faculties to come together and teams to come together, and for you and I to sit down and talk about our learners, leaders need to give their teachers some time to have these rich conversations that reflect the values of the school. So if the value is student-centered, then we need to give time for teachers to engage in this work that allows us to teach from a student-centered stance. Time is an important piece that we need to lift up.
I'm so glad you paired time with values, though, because if we're not given time, we're just going to slip into what's always been done. But if we're saying as a school we value X, we need the time to process, well, what might that look like? And that question of might in assessment, I think, is what's often missing in schools.
I couldn't agree more. You know, what we value needs to be shown in how we're ordering and how we're placing and what's on the top of the list and what's on the bottom of the list. I was just speaking to a group of leaders, and I asked them to encourage their staff to use provocation. That was the last thing I taught them, the last thing I showed them. I said, leaders, when you email out your staff next week, please put provocation in your email. And then I said, not only put it in the email, make it the first thing in your email.
Cool.
And model it. Say, I'm really curious about how you took curiosity to your learners through provocation. I'd like you to consider sending me evidence of. So modeling it and not having it be at the bottom of the email. If you value curiosity, it's the first thing in the email, which again, I know the portfolio of leaders and how robust it is and how full it is and how stressful it can be. But we need to model the model. And if we truly value student-centered, then we need to show our staff that in every way possible, whether it's a newsletter or how we talk with one another. Absolutely.
Beautiful. I think that's a beautiful spot to pause. So I've got a final set of 3 questions that I'm going to ask every guest who comes on the show. So you are the first ever to answer our final 3. Are you ready for them, Trevor?
I'm ready. Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Okay. So the first one, what is a book that has had the most profound impact on your life or your practice?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can't pick a single book, but I'm going to talk about some authors that have had a huge impact on my practice. That 20 years ago, I never thought that these authors would be, critical friends or co-speakers, but right away, I think of Kath Murdoch and her rich body of work and the research that she's been engaged in she'll kill me for saying this, but for over 30 years, she's been in inquiry settings. And so she's written 17 books, and all of them have had an impact on my career in one way, shape, or form. I think of Ron Berger. I think of all the things I do with my students around feedback and formative and conferring, and everything is kind of gifted in Ron Berger's body of work. I think of obviously Ron Richart and Mark Church and their work around thinking routines, and how the evidencing that I engage in with my students is actually a lot of the time founded in structures and protocols and frameworks that Ron has been researching for decades. So one book, no, but definitely a school of thinking. Who are the voices that have shaped a common direction for me and trajectory for me in terms of my teaching of teachers and my teaching of students? Absolutely more of a school of thinking, Cindy.
Can I push you a little to ask, do you remember the first one that you read that was just like a, oh,
Yeah, I'll hold it up for you. It was Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, Essential Questions. It was this one. And I remember exactly who handed this one to me. It was a teacher librarian, Jeff Orm. And he handed it to me and I thought, well, this is exactly what I needed. And I devoured it. It was such a palatable read. It's such a quick read. And there were so many things in it that I immediately did right away after I read it. And that took me down just like the spiraling of, okay, well, what's this? And what's this? And what's this over here? So this was the first, Essential Questions by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, the late Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe.
Isn't that so beautiful how the right book at the right time, it's just amazing. It's the best feeling in the world.
And from the right person, Jeff Orm, who handed me that book, like I know as he was handing it to me, I could trust the book because he knew what I was working on in my practice. We had been conspirators in inquiry for so long that when he handed it to me, I thought, oh, I really need this, because I trusted his support of me. I trusted his professional judgment. And so the right book at the right time from the right person says a lot. Hear that, leaders? Hear that, leaders? Absolutely.
And shout out to our school librarians, the heroes.
Absolutely.
Okay, question number 2 of the final 3. This is my personal research project. I find that leaders tend to kind of have this tension between joyous leadership, like sustainability and joy, and then like productivity. And people tend to fall in one camp or the other. So in your opinion, how do you strike a balance between the two, having joyous, sustainable workplaces, but also really productive workplaces?
Well, it's a spectrum. It's not a T-chart. It is a spectrum, right? It's not like the one side that you refer to, the joyous, and the other side sounds like the portfolio, the things that schools have to do, health and safety, managing and operating a building. It's not a T-chart. It is a spectrum. And I think when leaders think of it along the lines of a spectrum, it really shapes then how they interact and engage in the people in the building, or excuse me, with the people in the building. So at a staff meeting, if we understand these items along that spectrum, then we can understand how we have to shift and be nimble across that spectrum. So it's not a T-chart. And I think that's something that a lot of teachers and leaders tend to fall into is, oh, I could demonstrate that over here, but I certainly couldn't do that over here. Whereas it is a delicate dance. And in fact, it's the same delicate dance that our teachers are doing with their students. We are working with one scholar here who has really unique needs, really particular needs, and we support them. And then we literally turn and we have another scholar over here in our classrooms who has a very different list of needs and series of demands and feelings and experiences. If we are asking teachers to pivot powerfully, beautifully, mindfully, leaders, you need to model that model. What's really helpful for leaders is to talk about that spectrum of, the joyous to the portfolio aloud with teachers, and to model how they themselves are aware of that, how they themselves are going to step over here with this action item, but lean into this value in this action item over here. And then teachers are going to see how they could dance that delicate dance in their own practice with their own students. So again, I think a misconception that I'm hearing surface in our conversation is it's an either or, when really it is, how can we weave these two together and show like it's a spectrum, whether it's the swimming pool analogy or this spectrum of joyous versus portfolio.
And that tension, the vulnerability of sharing that process.
So powerful. Goodness. Sharing our thinking, sharing our feelings, modeling that model, of course. Then we're going to see teachers doing that with their students, which is just so healthy for student growth and competency development, for sure.
Love it. Okay, our final question today, although I'm loath to let you go. Final question. So all the experiences you've had in schools, you've been around the world, you've written books, you're in your own classroom.
Thank you. Yeah.
What's one piece of advice that you would give to all leaders that you just think would have the most transformative impact on their practice?
Well, it has to do with teacher agency, Cindy, and I'm so glad you've asked this question, because we often talk about student agency and students having voice and choice and opportunities for ownership over their learning, and then none of that exists for our teachers and how schools are operated and how schools are run. So I would say providing teachers with agency over parameters of which they teach in. Parameters around agency mean that there needs to be a clear direction. Like there is somewhat of a box, isn't there? It's not a free for all. So, for example, there are 10 student-centered assessment beliefs that the schools I support live by. They plan for, they learn about. Gosh, having agency within those 10 beliefs to dive deeply into a personalized teacher goal or some professional development about one of those goals that the teacher feels is highly important and relevant for their context and their career and their learners. That's teacher agency. It's not a free for all. They can't do professional development about anything. It's rooted in the value, student-centered assessment. So leaders listening, if we want agency for our students, where are we providing agency for our teachers? Again, the misalignment in asking teachers to do something that we in fact are not providing experiences that are similar or aligned. Teachers will revert back to what leadership is doing rather than what leadership is saying.
Yes. Can you define for me agency really fast? So what is your favorite definition of agency? Sorry to tag on one more.
Yeah, no, it's great. I talk about voice, choice, and ownership. Voice, choice, and ownership. And oftentimes I ask myself the question, am I doing something for myself that my students could be doing for themselves? Am I doing something for my students that they could be doing for themselves? And if the answer is yes, I remove myself from the situation. I empower them. I provide the conditions for them to take on ownership over whatever those parameters are. So leaders as well, is there something you're doing for your staff, for your student body that they could be doing for themselves? And how could you create the conditions for them to take ownership over that? So voice, choice, and ownership in short, but really being mindful of that question allows me to show up in a way where I'm sharing the landscape of the learning with my stakeholders.
I love that. So many amazing themes, empathetic design, always keeping the students at the center. I think that there's so many nuggets from today's conversation. And I just feel so honored that you are our first guest, Trevor.
I'm honored, Cindy. I always have such a fun time talking to you. You're an inspiration. I greatly appreciate your questions and your insights. And I look forward to seeing other episodes in this series. So thank you for inviting me to be the first. Greatly appreciated.
Yeah, stay tuned. All right, guys, that's it for our first episode, and we'll see you next time on the School Leaders Project.